what's the, what's the biggest challenge, and what kind of practices are you putting in place to work with that challenge? Because what we always talk about in these integrating leadership workshops that I do for Venture Cafe is one little aspect of leadership, and we talk about it like a practice. It's not a, ooh, here's how you lead, because I don't know how you lead. How you lead is your best practice, and I don't know what that looks like, but it's about how you practice your leadership. So today we want to talk about that practice of getting in your power, into flow, into peak performance when, the world's upside down and inside out. And we all know it. And people have been asking me, how are you doing? What's your biggest challenge? And sometimes it's like, my biggest challenge is admitting that I'm not as challenged as people think I should be. Like, people are, you're in denial, you're this, you're that. I'm like, it's the practices that I've had in place for, I don't know how many years, that are keeping me somewhat sane right now, which means it gives me resources to help people that don't have the resources I do. I'm absolutely blessed. I'm grateful for it every day. So if people are chatting, I'm not seeing it, so I'm going to assume I'm not missing anything, hopefully. What we're talking about today is really the biology, neurology, even, epigenetics, the structural part of you being at your best. So people talk to me about mindset a lot, and they're like, you're a mindset coach. Well, mindset is certainly one aspect of what pretty much any coach is going to address. But mindset is really in the psychology, the individual aspect of you. And, there are some things about epigenetics and DNA that are part of that too. But that's individual to you. You came into the world a unique being, and your mindset has been changed through your experiences. So to work with that, we're talking about, one person, unique you. How do you get into your peak performance? Well, I can't tell you that in a group session. Yeah, overwhelming uncertainty, and you can't plan a month or a week. That's, Martin, I will tell you, that's exactly what we're going to talk about, is that almost allergy to insecurity and the unknown that we're born with. It's the way that our brains are set to work. So, maybe some of this will help free that up. So many times we're in the, if you look at the masculine and feminine action taking, and I don't mean, biological gender, but we think of the feminine action taking as the contemplation, the ideation, the coming up with new ideas, and the masculine is going out and doing. So many of us have been in that go out and do for so long. When we can't come up with a plan to go out and do, our brain says, I can't work the way I always work, so I don't know how to work, right? So I think that's a challenge for a lot of people. And when this hit, I saw a lot of people really kind of frantic to figure out what they needed to do. And I counseled a lot of my clients to sit down and look internally and first ask themselves what they needed for them. Because it's hard to go out and do and go out and do and go out and do if you run out of internal resources. So I think, back to your enthusiasm for the shop's mission, that's kind of an internal thing. So maybe some of this will help. When we talk about, what we're going to talk about today, we're talking about the brain, how the brain is wired. And as human organisms, we're actually structured pretty much the same. So one of my mentors, Christopher Duncan, says that success isn't personal, it's structural. So kind of think about that for a minute. So we always think about success as personal. How you define success, definitely personal. Even how you go after success, it's your personal journey. It's as unique as you are. But before that, we have to deal with the structure of who we are as human beings, how we've evolved. So we've evolved to be optimized to work at our very best. But we came into this world really optimized for a world that humans used to live in. We haven't quite evolved to be optimized for this world because it's moving really fast. Evolution doesn't move that fast. So our brain evolved to be optimized in a world where physical survival was the #1 goal. Just you're alive another day, so you're all good, right? And that really depended on threat recognition and response. It depended on urgent risk assessment and mitigation. It depended on not being alone, which is really challenging a lot of people right now. It depended on what we think of as linear and local problem solving, which I think is why you see a lot of people kind of getting it when they get into crisis mode, they get into the me and mine, right? However they define me and mine. Maybe it's, you know, me and my family, whether it's me and my community, whether it's me and other people that look like me and other people in my faith community, me and other people that are American, but that mentality starts to shift. People don't have space to think about the people that are outside of what they think of as their clan. And that's not because they're not empathetic or compassionate or good people. That's something that we have to work to overcome, because that is actually the way our brains evolved. It's natural, but it's all about noticing. If you've heard me speak before, you know, I always say the #1 skill a leader needs is the ability to notice, because you can't change what you can't see. So, you know, notice if you're starting to get that focus of everything being linear, which is the predictability, right? The risk assessment, and everything being localized, because that's not the world that we're living in. That's not what this crisis is about. You know, that worked when our biggest problem was like, I got to outrun the bear. So, right, you got to run faster than everybody else. Okay, problem solved. And if it was me and mine, then, you know, I got to get my people to safety, and all we have to do is stay ahead of everybody else. And you know, the bear and you know, we are happy, and the people in between, not my problem. That can't be this crisis. That's not the world we're living in. And to tell you the truth, that's not the world we've lived in for a while. We just haven't adapted to the world that we're actually living in, because the world we're living in already is already global. And honestly, it was viral before we were dealing with a virus. So you know, I look at it in consulting. We often say profits mask problems. Have you ever heard that? Profits mask problems. So it's not like you got all the profit you can have, but you got enough profit that you think must be doing something right. Ain't broke, don't fix it. So you never look at the problems. You don't notice the things that could be optimized. You don't notice the things that really aren't working in the long run. You just kind of keep generating those profits. And then something like this hits and you're like, problems, right? So a lot of the problems that are really coming home to roost right now in a big, scary way, those problems existed. They're just really, you know, it's really like most virus works. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the virus, but my mother had shingles in her 3rd trimester with me, so I've carried the Epstein-Barr virus all my life, and it didn't express until I was in my 20s, and then it rose up and bit me big time. So I learned a lot about the virus, and how the virus affects the human system. And one of the things that I learned is we often suppress the symptoms because that's the treatment, and we think that's all we can do. And all that happens is the virus goes, oh, I'll run over here behind some biofilm, and I'll hide and I'll colonize, and I will mutate, and I will live. So a lot of the problems that we're looking at right now were already viral. We just didn't have to look at them. It's like we were those proverbial frogs in the cold pot of water, right? We didn't notice when the heat source got turned up. So here's what I think has emerged as being really important in terms of adapting. So let's talk about adapting before we talk about really power and flow, because first we have to know how to adapt. So interdependence and collaboration. Boy, if there's anything that this is pointing out, it's how interdependent everything is, right? So you see one industry or one sector affected, and you don't think about all the other industries that's going to affect. for instance, you know this is going to affect travel. Well, then you stop and think, well, what about all the people that own the parking, the big, parking garages for commuters? And, obviously, what about transportation, other transportation and the whole hotel industry? But then what about all the suppliers of all the things that a flight uses, like the snacks and the paper goods and all of that? It's all going to be affected. What about the people that own shops inside of the airport? Nobody's flying. So it's really brought out that we are interdependent, and that's why I say that this problem has to be solved globally, not just globally like around the world, but globally looking at it from all angles. Really a panoramic global view of what we're working with. The cool thing about that, to Martin's point, and I'm looking at, I can get this thing to scroll. I see a comment. I can't. Okay, Donna, let me look. Yes, travel advisor. Yes. Okay. And gratitude does so much, doesn't it? There's a whole science behind that. You probably know. Yes, and it's moving so fast. So one of the things about this interdependence is, if you're all affected by the same thing, it's just smart. It's just common sense to say, how could we solve the problem the same way? Or how can we partner with an industry that's actually impacted in another way? So for instance, I think it was JetBlue had all these snack trays, the cheese and crackers and all the goodies that they couldn't take delivery of. And Imperfect Foods, if you're familiar with Imperfect Foods, picked that up. So now food's not going to waste. People at home have the opportunity to get something they would normally only get when they fly. And that is now covered. So a lot of that interdependence and collaboration, when you start recognizing the interdependence, it sets up an opportunity for collaboration, and then you can get creative with that. Innovation and flexibility. I mean, that's really what Donna's saying is, and we can sit and be inflexible, or we can be flexible and innovate. One of the tenets that I love, that says the person who is the most flexible controls the situation. You ever heard that? And it sounds like, whoa, wait a minute. I think the person that controls the situation is the one that puts a stake in the ground and has the power to stand the ground. Well, you can't control the situation very long that way. That's actually a very fragile position to be in, because you've limited your options. So the more options you have, the more flow you're in, the more power you have. And options requires flexibility. So interdependence, innovation, and then really inner work and self-induced evolution. And that's, of course, that's my, I don't even know that you just limit it to a passion. That's really what I start with every time I'm faced with anything, whether it's dramatically good or dramatically bad. I start with that self-reflection and self-induced evolution, because every change, especially if it's dramatic, offers an opportunity for extreme change. So we're going to talk about why that is in the clinical brain. Not just you make a decision to change, but our brains become wired for change when we have really dramatic changes externally. So we're going to talk about that. Some challenges, I think, for leaders to be better leaders is, we're really going to have to gain a better understanding of what's going on in our own brains, bodies, and minds. And we're going to have to know what's going on in other people's brains, bodies, and minds. Like, and you've probably heard me say this before too, if you've heard me speak, is the whole thing about, hire people without baggage. And I was like, really? If they're old enough for you to hire them, they got baggage. It's a given. The question is, how are they dealing with their baggage? Have they unpacked their baggage? Have they actually turned that baggage into strengths? And are you okay with knowing the story of their baggage to help them express those strengths? That's going to be more and more incumbent on the leaders as this unfolds and as we emerge on the other side. I kind of think right now we have global PTSD happening. So you've probably heard me say a lot of times, you're working with more survivors than you know. If you just look at statistics about how many people have been abused, raped, whatever, by a certain age, statistically, you're surrounded by people who have survived rather extreme abuse. And we don't talk about their stories, but they're there. I think one of the most startling things when I talk about my own story from the stage is the number of people who quietly come up to me afterwards and say, you never think it happened to somebody else, or you never think that you can get past it and be a success, or whatever. I mean, it's fairly universal that people have someone in their close circle who's a survivor. Well, at this point, by the time we get to the other side of this, we're all going to be survivors, because however you're dealing with it, it's still traumatic. It's traumatic for all of us at different levels. We're all kind of in the same storm. We're just not all in the same boat. So as leaders, we can try to get people to just get over it, get past it, go back to normal, even though normal was burnout, normal was dysfunction, normal was, no separation between work and, your personal life. Or we can say, hey, here's an opportunity when we're all experiencing the same thing to figure out how we can experience it, grow from it, be better because of it. So that's the opportunity that we have. That means we have to recognize that the way that we've evolved is not only informing our own response and performance, which is what we're going to talk about today, but I want to set the stage for you to think about how it informs the response and performance of every other person that you interact with, whether you interact with them professionally, personally, closely, remotely. Right now, everything's pretty much remote, but as we go back into public spaces too, give a little grace to yourself and everybody else. This is a new world. We're paying attention to new things the brain is not wired to pay attention to. So, thinking about that in our leadership, whether we're business leaders, community leaders, healthcare leaders, government leaders, whatever, we want to start asking how we can be better, but we also want to get creative about how we can help other people be better, because we actually, by the time we finish today, all of us will probably know some things that most people don't know about themselves, about their brain response, about how they're wired, and how they can turn that biology into something that works for them instead of against them. In a survey recently, I saw the result. I asked you what was challenging you. One of the survey results I saw, and everybody was surprised, and I actually wasn't. The top 3 concerns that people expressed, and these were, top C-suite performers: money, security, health came in first. Sure, that's the kind of crisis we're in. But the second was a lack of focus or creativity, just not feeling it. And the third was a lack of motivation and a tendency to procrastinate. So we're going to talk about those things because they're normal. I can't remember if I was listening to a podcast or a live or LinkedIn or whatever. It was a video talking about the survey results. They were like, that was really surprising. You're in the middle of this crisis and you're worried about your lack of focus. Like, why would you worry about that? Or you're not motivated. Oh, gee, big surprise. Yeah, it's normal. But they were kind of implying it's normal, nothing you can do. And the nothing you could do part is not true. There are things that you can do. You can optimize your brain. You can start an adaptation process. There are really 2 ways that we change. One is this kind of crisis, extreme demand. You must change right now. So it's like the car accident that forces you to change your lifestyle. And then the other is what we call the SAID principle. If you're in to physical performance, you probably already know this: specific adaptation to imposed demands. So if you need, I'll type it in chat. But specific adaptation to imposed demands, SAID. And basically what that means, for instance, if you're trying to build muscle strength, is that if your goal is to bench press 300 pounds, you do not get there by constantly trying to bench press 300 pounds. We all know how that is, right? You're not going to go from 0 to 60 just by going 60. It's specific adaptation to post demand. So it's the consistent imposition of a demand that requires that adaptation. Well, that's what we have the opportunity right now. That's why I call it a practice. So we can practice some things that will make us better leaders, and won't just make us better leaders when we think about it. They'll actually cause our brains to adapt so that we become better leaders. I have somebody in the, there we go. Keeping an eye on that waiting room. So here's how we're designed or optimized by default, okay, to perform in crisis. We are built to respond to a crisis that's, I would call it progressive. So it happens in this linear, logical progression. We kind of know what to expect. So back to Martin's comment, like, we don't know what to expect and our brains are freaking out because that's not what it's wired for. We're built to respond to a crisis that is local. It's isolated to our community, or at least if it wasn't isolated, then the aspects that are far-reaching don't really affect us. So that's one of the first things that I said when the news started coming out about what we're going through right now, is that, you know, certainly we've had these kinds of crises before, but every other crisis of my lifetime anyway has affected pockets of the world. And then there were pockets of the world that were largely looking on. They were observers. They might be up in arms, but they're up in arms for somebody else's sake. It's not impacting them directly. Well, we're in a crisis right now that isn't localized anywhere, right? It's worse some places than others, but it's not isolated. Brain doesn't know how to deal with that. Just can't handle it. We're built to deal with problems that have an immediate, urgent, and they're solvable. Like, we can look and say, I know how to respond to this and I know it will end. You hear a lot of people saying when this is over, and then a lot of experts are saying, guys, don't know that it's really going to be over. We're going to deal with it differently, which makes sense. I mean, the flu isn't over, but our brains are really craving the tell me when this is going to end, tell me when this is going to end, or tell me how I can end it. And we need to recognize that's not really just fear. I mean, it is a form of fear because our brains obviously produce all kinds of fear chemicals when we don't know how to handle something, but it's also because we haven't adapted to be able to handle this kind of crisis. So we're built to respond to those problems. Here's the cool thing. We're built to respond with massive amounts of energy and innovation. So brain goes, whoa, problem. It immediately says, do something different and do it right now. So when the news came out, you saw a lot of people that were like, yes, we can get through this. We'll do something different. We'll do this right now. And now that it's been going on for a while, they're like, I don't know what different to do, and I'm tired and I don't want to do anything right now. Because the brain, the biology produced a ton of energy and creativity. And now people want to get back into peak performance. They want to get back into power and flow. And they're like, yeah, I got nothing. That's normal. That's the way our brains are wired. And you really can do something about that. So the other way that we're built to change, like we said, is through big things, but also to adapt fluidly. So we basically evolve through survival. We don't really do anything, but we make little choices that don't seem to be producing change. And if we survive, we adapt. I mean, technology's definitely been that kind of thing. So, you know, we evolve. We can't evolve fast enough for this. We are dealing with a crisis that is actually global. It's exponential. Changes what is happening to us at an alarming rate. It doesn't compute. So your brain starts trying to simplify things, right? So what we need to do, obviously, is meet this with global exponential solutions. So we need to wrap our heads around it, even though our brains are not wired for it. So we need to wrap our brains around it. We need some, I guess, some good news. We need some tools. So the first thing that I always recommend is you think about the chemical cocktail that you're releasing into your system when you have a state of being. So by state of being, it could be simply I've reached a point where I've exhausted that initial surge of superhuman energy. I've exhausted the innovation that comes with the fear response. That whole fight or flight thing, yeah, I'm burned out on that. And that is my state of being. Just think about the chemical cocktail that you've got going on and how you might be able to make it work for you. I know you didn't expect that, right? You're like, chemical cocktails, no wonder I'm tired. Yeah, that's all true. But here's some good things about the chemicals that you release during that period of time. One of those chemicals, there's two words, two names for it. You'll hear them used interchangeably. One is noramphetamine, and one is norepinephrine. So it's produced basically through the sympathetic nervous system. It's produced as part of your fear response. Here's the cool thing. That chemical in your system actually primes your brain for learning and response. It's like, it's this wake-up call chemical that says, hey, this is new novel information. I don't know what to do with this. I don't already have a program running that lets me go on autopilot. So we're not on autopilot right now. We need to wake up and pay attention. And I don't think this is something you can afford. It's now priming your brain to remember whatever comes next. So, you know, I've had some people say, I don't see that studying anything right now or learning anything right now makes sense. I'm in too much stress. Right now, there is a window when that hormone will actually help you remember new information. So for myself, I'm going through a certification program that's extremely intense. It's something that combines a lot of the things that I've practiced and done pretty much all of my 30 years. Ooh, not quite. I became self-employed in 1994. It's been a long time. I've studied a lot of different things. And this certification class is something that I was just like, I don't know that I have the bandwidth for that. And now it's not just that I have the bandwidth because of this. I actually don't have any more time than I usually do, but I'm turning that norepinephrine response into doing some deep learning. So that's something you can think about, because your brain is actually primed. It's like priming a pump for that. That kind of remembering is actually a factor in PTSD. I mean, it's set some triggers, but you can also set anchors. If anybody wants to know more about anchoring practices and how to set emotional anchors, I should say emotional anchors, physical anchors to get you into an emotional state that you prefer. So going from threatened and uncertain to confident and bold, for instance, you can anchor in confident and bold and return to that at will. And it does take practice and it takes repetition, and it's not just like, you know, flip a switch casually and you're good. That it is a lot like flipping a switch. I've practiced with anchors a long time, and this course that I'm doing had some new information that really got me excited. So if you want to do a little work on anchors, just type your email address in and we'll do something. So right now, your brain is capable of some pretty amazing stuff. That's good for a while. If you use that chemical cocktail to do what it's priming your brain to do, learn, change, evolve, and I will say the bigger the emotional impact, the stronger the anchor. So if you're using this learning process right now to actually learn something that's favorable, it will really anchor in deeply. It's why I'm using this time to do the deep learning that I'm doing, because I know I've got a brain primed for it, and I know that that kind of constructive use of that energy is going to be healthier for me than letting it build up in the body. Because when it builds up in the body, it can do some really destructive things. It can keep your sympathetic nervous system going when that's not necessarily what you want to have happen. It's also really biologically expensive to keep producing that chemical cocktail. So norepinephrine and cortisol are the two primary chemicals that you're going to be producing if you're in that fear, uncertainty, brain's going, not built to deal with this, can't understand what's going on. And you don't want to keep that up for very long because it starts hoarding it in your body, and then you're going to have some some physical responses. Like one of the things that I figured out a long time ago is that in managing the pain that often comes with the Epstein-Barr fibromyalgia is I needed to keep my system relatively cortisol free. Well, that is a action chemical. Cortisol primes you, just as norepinephrine primes you to learn and remember and change and evolve. Cortisol primes you to get the heck out of Dodge because there's a bear, right? I don't know, were bears in Dodge? Probably not. But you know what I mean? So you got to get these things out of your system. You don't want them building up in the body. That's not a high performance state. Anchoring, Farzana, I've got your email. We will follow up on that. It's a powerful practice. I've used visual anchors, audio anchors, and I'm now learning more about setting physical anchors. So I got you, girl. So when we hit that state, we're not in high performance. We've got this chemical cocktail building up in our system. We know we're sinking, right? We can feel it. We start getting desperate. That's a lot of times people are just desperate to take action because action makes them feel like they're in control, but the brain knows better. Brain knows you're not in control. So brain is still freaking out. It starts looking for really, really simple answers and simple solutions, simple information. Now, here's the scary thing about that. And the minute I say it, you're going to flash to your Facebook feed or LinkedIn feed. And you're going to be like, oh, I get what's going on now, right? Because when it starts to simplify things, it wants answers, solutions, options that are these things, binary. It wants black or white, right or wrong, true or false. You're with me, you're against me. This is completely right or this is completely wrong. This theory can be proven. This theory is debunked completely. There's no validity in it. Completely ignore it. This is the right answer. This is the wrong answer. You know what happens when you get in binary state? Remember when I said the more options you have, the more power you have, and the person who is most flexible will control the situation? Boy, binary is the complete opposite of that state. So as soon as we get into this either or treacherous dichotomy arena, the brain is happy. Oh boy, I can finally make decisions based on something really simple instead of all that complex stuff I couldn't understand, but it's making bad decisions. Yes, we've lost that gray area. And frankly, most of the answers, especially right now, they're in that gray area. I had a young man sit me down after one of my venture cafe sessions, and he kept asking me questions and then he'd say, do you agree or disagree? Is that right or wrong? And I finally said, dude, you're missing out on everything that I could possibly share with you that has meaning, because everything I have to say that matters is neither. It's neither yes or no, agree or disagree. It's the nuances in between. So right now, you want to be teaching your brain to get comfortable with nuances. Nuances also include uncertainty, right? It starts looking for things that are linear. So assumptions. And if you've seen me speak before, you know we talk about prediction versus assumption, that the brain is wired to make assumptions, but it's because it's taking that predictive ability, which is the brain is a predictive process, and instead of seeing a prediction, it's taking a shortcut and going, I'm going to assume I'm right. So a lot of assumptions being made, and a lot of assumptions that are then binary, right? It's got to be yes or no, so I'm going to assume yes because that's the closest. Again, losing a lot of options. It becomes very local. We talked about that. All the options start narrowing to my tribe, the people I know, who can I talk to that I already know, when really, back to interdependence, most of the creative work that we need to be doing right now is probably somebody that you don't know. And maybe somebody very different in a different industry, or maybe a competitor. And that's where that interdependence and that cooperation is going to come into play to innovate. And then the other thing gets shut down, of course, is creativity, empathy, critical thinking, collaboration, innovation, plump. And it's not because you decided to shut it down. It's because if you're running on default programming, all of those things are just simply not available, off the menu. We sold out last week. We're done. So that's what default programming is bringing a lot of people to right now. And I look at Facebook, and there's a part of me that, gets as irritated as anybody else. And there's a part of me that says, this is just a lab. It's a laboratory for, this is how the human brain works. It's not wrong. It's just not working in this situation. I say that to clients a lot. Well, it's not wrong, but how's it working for you? Are you getting what you want? So that's really what we're thinking about it right now. It's not a choice. It's just the default performance when the unconscious or subconscious is in charge. So what can we do? I think we have a slightly shorter session today. So I'm gonna speed up a little bit, but I will also tell you, you can email questions to me. The easiest to remember, because my name's on here, is just DixieGillespie@gmail. And that is actually where my business email gets forwarded anyway. So if you've got questions, just drop me an email. If you want the replay, drop me an email, let me know. So here's why you have people, even before this crisis, that were concerned about focus, flow, creativity, motivation. People who said, oh, I get really distracted, or I procrastinate a lot, even things that are important, or maybe the things that are most important, right, or the things that are getting procrastinated. They're having problems with problem solving, critical thinking. We did a session a few months ago on critical thinking and had some really good questions because people were really challenged with critical thinking already. And now we're in crisis. Of course, that's we're exaggerated, but even before, the work environments that we were in created a lot of the same crisis that we're experiencing right now. So the work environments put us in the same body brain state as the state that we're kind of defaulting to right now, if we haven't changed our default settings, because they were somewhat indistinct, uncertain, long-term, low-level stressor that was broken up with some really high-stakes sprints. So a lot of people went into this crisis with all of that already overtaxed. Like their sympathetic nervous system was firing all the time. They're producing norepinephrine all the time. They're producing cortisol all the time. And now we're in this crisis, and it's just dumping more of those chemicals. We need to reset. We need to adapt. So that, because I'll remind you, that chemical cocktail, it's just like if you intentionally ingested a drug. Once it's in your system, it's in your system. It's like if you thought you had a really bad cold, so you took some NyQuil, and then you go, oh, wait a minute, it's allergies. It's not a bad cold, it's allergies. Yeah, that NyQuil is still gonna put you to sleep. So if it's in your system, it's in your system. It's not like, oh, I figured out I don't have anything to be afraid of, and the cortisol immediately exits the building. It's not how it works. So you came into this, and everyone else came into this situation with whatever chemicals they'd been producing in response to whatever inner state they had been in before. So it makes it kind of hard, right? You're carrying that inner state from place to place. It's like wherever you go, there you are. Well, there you are. So to adapt your brain for the challenges of today's world, and to help, as a leader, to help other people adapt their brains, but also to respond to other, you can't always do something for others if they're not cooperative. But the other thing these practices do is when you look at somebody else and you start to recognize, oh, that's just their brain on default, is one, you realize there's no ill intention there, right? It's not malevolent. They're just operating on default mode. They're just not conscious of what's going on. And we all have times like that. It's not like, oh, they're so not self-aware and I'm so aware. I have my times, I have my days, I probably have my weeks. Somebody call me on that. So when we recognize that, empathy comes in stronger. The ability to respond to them comes in stronger, because we're not impugning some kind of agenda to them that they don't have. So it could be helpful even if they're not doing the work. So getting back into power and flow. So one of the things that I tell people, and this sounds counterintuitive, but it's important, is take your focus off the problem you're trying to solve. So here's what happens. In our work culture, we're always told, focus on the problem and do something about the problem. right? We focus on the problem. What happens in the brain? The problem becomes the only thing you can see, which means, again, you've limited your options. Because if the problem is the only thing you can see, and the way you understand the problem is the only thing you can see, then you can't think of solutions that are outside of your current understanding of the problem. The brain can't do it. It's just not how that organism is programmed to work. So take your focus off of the problem. One of the things that, people that do puzzles or solitaire or, anything that requires strategy, thinking ahead, can prime the brain for the problem that you're trying to solve at the same time that takes your brain off the problem. So sometimes it's just back up, but it's really about focus and perspective. So the other thing that happens when you're really action oriented and you can't come up with a solution to put into action, your brain recognizes now that's a problem. It's not just you had the original problem. The brain is now responding to the problem of, I don't have a solution for the original problem. So your poor brain is trying to solve a lot of problems. Basically what you've done is you've upped the ante on your alert systems. Yay, right? So you basically just poured gasoline on an existing fire thinking, well, gasoline's wet, it'll put out the fire. We know it doesn't work that way. So the way that we're born to approach these problems doesn't work long term. It can serve you short term. We've already talked about that. Doesn't work long term. One of the reasons I started putting all this together to present for Venture Cafe is starting to understand my own process and what I'm doing right now. Like backing up and saying, well, how am I approaching this? And how am I practicing? And where is my practice lacking? And where do I have gaps? And where can I help other people more? And where do I need to back up and help myself first? So part of this was taking my focus off the immediate problem and looking at it from a higher, more encompassing level too. Because I'm as human as anybody. I have same challenges, same breakdown, same whatever. But I cycle really fast. Like I move through that. I can go boom, I'm back in power and flow. So how do I do that? Let's talk about that. Let's talk about some practices. I'm gonna regroup, and we're gonna talk about some practices for flow. So one of the things that if you study creative flow, that they talk a lot about. I think they call it the challenge to skill ratio. I always think of it as challenge to ability or challenge to resources. So our brain is optimized to perform at its optimal best when there's tension between the challenge and the perception of resources, ability to solve the problem, skills, whatever. So just enough tension, the brain goes, whoa, it's doable. It's hard, it's a reach, it's a stretch, it's doable, ready, set, go. If you're stretched too much, in fact, if you're having trouble with procrastination or focus, if it's stretched too much, the brain can't perform. And honestly, if it's stretched too little, the brain gets lazy. It just doesn't really fire that way. The striving instincts don't really kick in. So procrastination could actually be because things seem to be easier, or maybe you have fewer deadlines than usual. If work's slow, then it might be a combination of you can't solve the big problem, back to Martin's thing of, it's hard to stay enthusiastic and be that, evangelist. And there's so much uncertainty, but the day-to-day tasks and challenges that are defined that you need to solve may be fewer. So you could be in less creative tension, while at the same time you're in big problem-solving tension. So let's talk about the training to the edge, or getting that structural tension and creative tension right. You want to, just like training, you want to train just outside your edge. And if the problem is huge, then it's the progressive approach, right? So if you think about something that you're working toward, or something you want to be more creative about, sometimes just chunking it down and at the same time expanding your opportunities. So for instance, the work that I do what I call an idea bank. So it's kind of a brain dump. Sometimes I do a brain dump first. That way I get all the problems and all the little things I need to do and, you know, all the not fun stuff out of the way. And then I pull the ideas out of that. But chunk it down to where you've got this huge bank of things that you could do that are ideas, and how small can you make them? So if your idea, for instance, is start a podcast, then one chunk might be come up with concepts for artwork. Okay, so chunk it down and get into that celebration mode. So you've got just enough tension between challenge and ratio that you're fired up. Get that done, and that celebration mode starts fueling the brain. Now you're teaching the brain, can too do this, can too do this. You thought you couldn't wrap your head around it, can too. And that's really important, because now you can tolerate more structural tension or creative tension between what is and what you want to be. Okay, so you know, think of it kind of like a rubber band. Like if you stretch it all too much immediately, it breaks. If you stretch it a little, stretch it a little, stretch it a little, it doesn't work so good as a rubber band anymore. So maybe I shouldn't use that analogy. But it will stretch without breaking, and that's the important thing. So it adapts. So that not only starts to adapt the brain, it also uses up that chemical cocktail. So you can be in a better inner state because your chemicals are starting to balance out. Okay, so, you know, chunk it down. I think there's so much wisdom in the old one day at a time, or, you know, one milestone at a time. If you've ever like, you know, kind of tried to get through the day with, well, when I get that done, I'll think about the next thing. But if you think about everything that has to be done for the day, you're tired and you haven't even gotten started. So that's nothing new. I bet everybody who's with me, everybody who's watching the replay is like, yeah, I know how to do that. But did you know how important it was? Says we all know to do that, but it's important to the way your brain works. It's important to the way your brain adapts. It's important to building strength. It's important to building flexibility. It's important to building innovation. It's not just a practice to help you get through the day where you can say, well, I should be strong enough not to need to do that practice. It is a practice that will make you better at getting through every day easier. So it's worth doing even if you think you ought to be able to handle it without doing that practice. So practice that. That also might help you actually with procrastination. Just think about that, because the brain peaks under pressure, but it breaks under extreme pressure. So when you find that nice sweet spot of how much tension you can have between the challenge and resources and abilities, and you practice in that sweet spot, you will procrastinate less, you'll get more done, and frankly, you'll feel better about it. Your inner state starts to change. And you know, more of that celebration, more of that confidence. So I think right now a lot of us are kind of oscillating between overwhelm and fear and stimulate and boredom, because, you know, we read something, we freak out, you know, it's extreme stress, the brain function starts to break. But then in a lot of ways, we don't have the same stimuli we used to. Going out, seeing each other, you know, going to Venture Cafe and hanging out instead of getting online and hanging out, you know, our stimuli has definitely changed. So that's one key. You know, there's some basic foundations that I'll mention really quick, and these are not, none of these are going to solve the problem, but honestly, if you're not doing most of these consistently, if not all of them consistently to optimal, then nothing I teach you is going to make a heck of a lot of difference. How do I know? Personal practice. I'm always like, I can power through it, right? I don't need to do these things. Wrong. Human, I need all these things too. And so I'd see this list. This is not my list. This is the list that, you know, any performance trainer will give you, any flow trainer will give you. First of all, sleep. Most people need 7 to 8 hours. You know, if you're like me, you can go on 4 or 5, you know, 2 or 3 nights even, and then it's like, yeah, I got to catch up, and kind of have that breakdown. Fuel, nutrition, and hydration, don't skip it. And I think that's really something that a lot of people are not sleeping well right now, and they're not on their normal schedule of eating. And we might think, well, that's just affecting my body. It affects your brain too. So, you know, as much as we'd all like to say this is a good excuse to eat whatever I want, your brain won't thank you for it. The third is really important. It's really difficult right now. Is one reason I wanted to go through this list really quickly, is social support. And there's a lot of reasons you need social support. Some people need more in-person contact, whatever. But here's the brain aspect of that. If you're optimizing your brain and working with other people to help them stay healthy and productive and in that flow state, is that to our brain, a stronger network implies safety. So the more broad your social structure, the more safety your brain supposes that you have. And you can definitely see the connection, right? Mindfulness, I've talked about mindfulness and focus and meditation and breath work so much. Especially it trains that space. I think almost every time I speak, I use that Viktor Frankl quote about, between stimuli and response, there is a space. It trains that space so that you're more comfortable in that space between stimuli and response, which again, builds options. Back to who has the most power, who controls the situations, options and flexibility. So that mindfulness practice will do a lot to help you train to make better use of that space between stimuli and response. Let's see. Let me just make sure I know. Oh, exercise. Duh. I'm like, what's number 6? Here's an interesting thing about exercise. So I think everybody was like, oh, I'm putting on the COVID-15 or whatever, I need to exercise. Exercise does more for you than that. Exercise, actually, there's something called, I remember the word, hypofrontality. Somebody Google that, but I'm pretty sure it's hypofrontality. Basically means you wear out the part of your brain that freaks out. And that allows you access to the part of your brain that's all about flow and performance. And I think that kicks in at about 20 to 30 minutes, something like that. Now I wish I'd have you can Google that. But exercise is not just, again, for body health, just like nutrition. That can actually give you access to that part of your brain that is able to be creative even in crisis, because the exercise wears out the part of the brain. Of course, it helps cortisol exit your system and all of that good stuff too. So think about these as stacks. If you've worked with me before, you've heard about anchors, you've heard about stacks. That a stack is, instead of doing, for instance, one exercise over and over and over, is you're stacking complementary practices on top of each other for maximum effectiveness. So, don't just think about, well, I'm going to start getting sleep and then I'm going to start exercising. Think about how you can stack it through your day. Just give that 1%, incremental change, that small improvement in every area, because they're going to start to remix that chemical cocktail that we talked about. They're going to give you some, a little more control over that chemical cocktail. So another thing that I feel is one of the best anchors in the world for me is the practice of gratitude. Gratitude and compassion as practices isn't just about, are you practicing your leadership, being grateful and being compassionate? A practice of gratitude and leadership and compassion changes your brain and makes you more creative, makes you more flexible. Actually, you will be more comfortable in whatever your leadership style is, whether your gratitude and compassion is actually showing up to the people you lead or whether you're practicing it, and it's just changing how you look at problems and how you look at people. So definitely a gratitude practice. And then finally, I really, these are things that I do throughout the day, and I think they're real challenges right now in this crisis. Yes, Jason, in all caps with exclamation marks. It does. It opens your brain to the possibilities and sees more of them, but it actually puts you in a different inner state. One of these days, I'll do a Venture Cafe session on the science behind that, because there's a lot of really great science behind a state of gratitude and a state of compassion and what that changes in brain frequency and all of that. But here are 4 practices I'm going to give you, or 3 practices. We talked about anchoring, so I'll give you the other 3 before we wrap up, we get kicked off of here. So 1, breath work. If you're familiar with breath of fire or Wim Hof breathing, that is great, but here's one that will reset the oxygen levels in your brain, and you'll be surprised. Is you inhale, I cannot do this and talk, and I'm talking, so y'all do it by yourself. You inhale until you think, my lungs will not hold anymore, and then you sniff really hard, just as hard as you can, and just push all the air you can into your lungs. That will change your oxygen levels in your brain. It's a great reset. 2 seconds. I mean, that one's fast. This one is really important. One of the things I've noticed is that people are going for walks, but they're still walking with this really tight focus. And especially, if they don't want to like engage with anybody because they're practicing social distancing, is we're not getting out and seeing the horizon. So to our brain, when it communicates with the body, so our physiology, just the way that we work, when we're in problem mode or fear mode, we're focused on the problem. So we've got our blinders on. So when your focus is tight, a tight focus, you're telling your brain it's in fear mode, it's in problem solving mode, it's in focus mode, it's in oh no mode. Get out and get in panoramic mode. So Philip and I have just been getting in the car and going for drives every now and then, or going somewhere where we can see the horizon. And at first I thought it was because I'm a country girl, I like my horizon. And then I thought, oh no, there's a physiological and neurological reset that happens when you broaden your physical focus. So get out and look into the distance. Don't have to do it for very long, and it will start to reset the brain. There's a guy, he's a neurologist, Andrew somebody. If anybody wants it, let me know. Can't think of it. Anyway, he said that when you expand your vision into panoramic mode, your brain processing picks up by like 4 times. Like it actually causes your brain to process faster, believe it or not. And then the final one, and this ties right into anchoring. And again, if you want more about that, it's DixieGlassby@gmail. And that is memory association. It's also gratitude is tied into this, is putting yourself in a different inner state by taking yourself to a time that was or will be or whatever. Visualizing is another good practice for this. But take yourself into a different state and associating this time that you're in with a time when you were confident, with a time that you were rewarded, with a time that you were joyful, with a time that you were, whatever you want to feel that isn't necessarily the way you're feeling in this practice right now. So those 3 tools are, kind of my go-tos when I need a reset, because I get out of the state I want to be in like all the time. People are like, oh, you're always. I'm like, no. I just know how not to be in that other state. And I know how to bring myself into the state. I don't live in the state all the time. I'm working on that, but it probably won't happen in this lifetime. But I know how to get into the state. So especially when I'm showing up for other people, because I always say, how you show up determines what shows up for you. When I'm showing up for other people, I know what state I want to be in. So these are my tools for getting into the state, inner state that I want to be in, building the health, building that creative flow and productivity and peak performance, even now. So breath work, really important. Try that inhale and sniff. Expand your vision. That's actually the one that I am using a lot right now, because we're inside so much and we're not driving to see other people. So get out and look at the horizon. It'll do your brain a lot of good. And memory association, or anchors. So that's what I've got. We're 2 minutes over. And I know I just crammed so much information into your heads, but hopefully it was helpful. Hopefully you'll go practice even a little of it. I do believe that there is another side, and I know not every business is going to be there, but one of the things that I keep reminding people is we aren't our business. Like, you never start over with nothing as long as you've got yourselves. So take care of yourselves, because if you do start over, you're starting over with something really powerful. I don't sugarcoat things and say we're all going to be fine on the other side, because some of our businesses won't be. But as long as you are fine and you're building yourself and you're building that inner power, Nobody can take that away from you. So all my best to all of you, and thank you for showing up. And again, if anybody wants the replay, email me. And I think that wraps it up for me today. Thank you all. Stay well.